Ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between and whatever else isn't even on that spectrum, I'm Layman Pascal, the Larry King of integrative pluralism, and this is the Integral Stages MetaPodcast. We podcast podcasters, broadcast broadcasters, and host the hosts who are trying to bring forward higher, deeper, and more transformative perspectives through online media. Today, we're happy to be sitting down with a guy who's interviewed several of the same people as myself, a sincere, thoughtful, grounded, and experienced fellow who's nonetheless willing to probe into the strange terrains of the weird, the subtle, the systemic, and the techno-futurist. He's the host of the Thinking Ahead podcast and the answer to the age-old question, what's the plural of a Carter Phipps? It's Carter Phipps. Hi, Carter.
Hi, Layman.
How was that?
I can see I need to up my game. I mean, I don't have anything like that. I need to do much better. It's good. I'm glad I'm on it.
I like to say it kind of lets me hit the ground running when I build up that weird momentum. I guess the first question is, why start a podcast? What are you doing? What was the idea?
I think it was just peer pressure. You know, when 100 million people have started a podcast, you know, you kind of have to do it. Oh, God, you know, I think everyone did I've been thinking about it for 5-10 years, you know, probably last 5 years. And I think the timing was right for me. But I mean, it was a funny thing because everyone during the pandemic was starting one. So you kind of feel stupid starting a podcast almost. But nevertheless, you know, I feel like one of the things I loved about when I was the editor of What is Enlightenment magazine years ago, you know, I have that background in journalism. I love engaging with people. I like writing and editing and those kinds of things. And I'm doing some of that as well. But I love the excuse to interview people, the excuse to have to read a book, have to do the study, have to prepare, have to engage with a bunch of ideas so you can talk to someone in a very serious way about it. And so the podcast in some ways is almost, you know, there's a number of reasons for it, but one of them is just to satisfy to give me an excuse to engage with the ideas and the kind of the future of culture and the way that I want to engage with it, which is I need to read this person's book. I'm fascinated by it. I'm going to get them to talk to, and we're going to have a great conversation about it. And so that's in some ways that's the main reason. But I also think, I like the idea of having a forum, a little bit like you just said, to cover a spectrum of ideas that are much wider than you see in the mainstream media or you see in some of these niche podcasts. You know, that's really integral in a kind of broad sense that really covers everything from the more esoteric and spiritual sides that you and I have a background in, but also can speak to mainstream issues, to politics, to issues around energy and environment, to issues that are very contemporary and very current with, you know, people who are dealing with those issues. So I feel like, you know, I sort of consider myself a generalist and someone can speak to but I just don't think there are that many podcast or media forms that can cover that range, that can go modern, that can go postmodern, that can really embrace that, or at least I haven't seen them. So I feel like if I have a talent, you know, I hope it's to be able to speak to a lot of different things and be able to go as deep as you want into maybe, you know, non-dual depths, to esoteric strangeness, you know, contemporary economic and political ideas, to do it all. And so I want to try to do it all on the podcast. And the essence of the podcast is like, what's the future of culture? Where are we headed? How do we think about the future? You know, it's that evolutionary sensibility at its essence. So that's kind of the idea.
That's fantastic. I relate to all that stuff. It seems to be like, there's 10 million people with podcasts, but there's only a small number of people who are pushing into this kind of space where I
think that's true.
It's full spectrum, and it's a number of these overlapping meta discourse communities, as well as like adjacent thinkers whose ideas might be useful to those communities, as well as satisfying my need to have relational interviewing interactions with people.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And sometimes I feel like it's just, there is something about, oh, I have a podcast with this person. I have to study this topic. I have to read their book. I have to do a deeper dive. There's something nice about having an excuse to do that too. I know it's just the discipline of doing that. It's nice. So.
We started the integral stage, which our original idea was to like span the whole thing. Like we'll get game B and metamodernism. And we also we want to be talking to Steve McIntosh, but we also want to start talking to some kid who's got a Spiral Dynamics TikTok page up. Like, let's cover the whole map here.
Yeah, good.
But we spread it into sub-series. And one of them is an author series for anybody who's got a book coming out. And that's the best for me because like you were saying, I then have to read that book, which I want to read, but I need an extra excuse to put time
exactly. That's the thing. I've got tons of books, but what do I read? Well, I read it because I have to. That's in the end, right? Exactly. No, it's so true. Now I don't have Ganesha, behind me. Does that help? Is that I may need some...
So far so good. He's the opener of the way.
It's good. I need something.
I guest host on Rebel Wisdom sometimes, and they think it's a little too esoteric, so I have to put like a curtain in front of it.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Well, they've been successful. They've done a good podcast.
Yeah. They're holding a strong position at the edge of this space.
Yeah, right. Well, that's cool.
I was thinking that, I've got this concept I call mythocolloquialism that sort of critiques the divide between mythic and colloquial language. Like we like myths and they sound exotic, but we often don't fully translate them. We often don't fully translate all the words in our sacred texts, and we leave some so they sound like people's names, but they're really words in another language.
That's good.
And the person who originally would have been talking about it back in the day would have heard it as the word.
Right.
So like we go, those people over there, they believe that Ares had a son named Phobos, but it doesn't sound so dumb when we go war breeds fear. That sounds pretty straightforward.
That's good. I like
likewise, we discussed the myth of Prometheus, which is a little distanced from us, but the myth of forethought or the myth of thinking ahead is something that's not distanced from us. And so that's the title of your thing. That's what I think about when I think of thinking ahead. I think of the potency that our ancestors were encountering that we refer to them as thinking about as Prometheus.
That's cool. That's interesting.
I'm curious about how you came up with the phrase and whether you feel like, is Prometheus the patron spirit of your project?
My Greek mythos is not as well developed as yours, I confess, but I love what you just said. And I think it was I have to give credit to my wife. I think she thought of the thinking ahead idea, but it's that, as I said, it's that evolutionary sensibility. I think Aurobindo, when he wrote his newsletter, his magazine back in whatever it was, 1915 or something like that, when he set out to write, I'm going to butcher the name. I can't, Arya? Was it Arya? His magazine, little newsletter he wrote in South India in 1912 or 1915 or whatever it was. He said it was designed to reach out to explore the thought of the future, to kind of, and that kind of groping forward, that sense, the Teilhard de Chardin talks about in his evolutionary sensibility, that groping forward, the exploratory tendrils of evolution as they reach out and sort of grope forward into culture and into our future and sort of suggest possible futures we can go down. So in some sense, that's my goal with that, is to embrace that kind of sensibility and to sort of what are the important areas that we need to think about, just in a very straightforward, but also explore some of the thought that is a little outside of the contemporary lingo and contemporary, sensibility, and try, so it's like I had someone on the podcast who was talking about the future of Saudi Arabia, and it was just very contemporary and but that's interesting. It's important what happens in the Middle East and the future of MBS and what he does in Saudi Arabia is, that has an impact on our political and economic worlds. And it was very interesting to me. And yet then I have Eric Wargo, who's talking about, the brain is a four-dimensional tesseract that can see forward into the future, and we have to understand, and that's what we're doing in dreams, and talking about the time travel and various things like that, which is also, he's a very serious guy, he's a very interesting guy, he's a very but it's totally completely esoteric comparatively. So in some ways, I feel like both of those are, they're in completely different ways are sort of reaching forward into the future. And then, as you know, Steve McIntosh and I have co-founded the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and Steve's put together the PostProgressive Post with Josh Leonard, our executive director. And that's a little more like, okay, how do we apply some of the integral ideas and cultural evolutionary ideas? How do we apply that to politics? How do we think about politics? And politics is such a mess right now. It's sort of demanding that we have a deeper understanding of what's happening in our culture. So that's another. I want to pursue some politicos and talk to them and see if we can inject some of these ideas into those worlds, and also try to understand, if we claim to have a more sophisticated or a more meta understanding of how culture evolves, it's got to show up in how we interpret some of the things in our current system that call out for like better solutions, that call out for like better perspectives. It's got to show up there. And politics is one of those areas where it's just hard and it's difficult and it's a pain. But so the PostProgressive Post is designed to kind of, be a forum for that. Yeah. So we'll see how we can pursue that. I mean, it's messy. Politics is messy. Sometimes you really want to get into it. I write about it. It's good. I've written a couple articles up there. And then sometimes you're just like, oh my God, politics, get me out of this. And let's talk about something else, for a while. But we have to deal with it, right? It's necessary.
Those, reminds me of, I don't know if you know the stand-up comedian Stephen Wright, but he had this joke about somebody points out that he's wearing two different socks, and he says, they're the same to me because I go by thickness. So that's like, there's all these different disciplines. You're like, well, what do all these things have in common that Carter's interested in?
I know.
Thematically,
exactly.
They have nothing in common, but what they have in common is that's what's arising at the leading edge and what could impact what's rising at the leading edge in all those disciplines. So it's exactly something like this in common rather than something like this in common.
I know people sometimes tell me one of my friends was calling it Phipps slash. Like back, it's like I'm listening to a podcast about Saudi Arabia one moment. I'm listening to a podcast about, time and the brain another moment. And I'm listening to something, it's just like that kind of, the spectrum is unusual. But for me, it does. I mean, some of it, look, I'll be honest, some of it's just my own passions and my own interest. But on a deeper way, these are areas that matter for the future in some way. And I just think we also have to get, I don't know, sometimes you tie. I think for those of us, for me, because I grew up in those sort of postmodern, more Eastern oriented spiritual progressive worlds. And then I had this very interest, though. I never lost my interest in sort of mainstream discourse. Sometimes you just get tired that people can't bridge those gaps, in interesting ways. So we have to in the future. We got to be able to bridge those gaps.
And I think anybody who can do it reasonably well, it's really useful to see them do it in public. Like people who can bring together different domains in their own mind and also attend to like what's arising on the tongue tip, the leading edge of their own consciousness.
Yeah.
To see anybody do that is a good template, a good role model because people just have to know that's an option is a huge thing.
Like it's so true. Like I absolutely, and to do it well can be hard because sometimes people I used to joke, I would go because when I've spent time in different cultural worlds, right, and I would spend time in a very sort of I know we're using some lingo, but you have an integral audience kind of, but like postmodern progressive worlds. And they have a whole way of interacting and the whole way of making meaning and the whole way they approach the things they're talking about. And then like I would go have another meeting with a much more modernist group. And it's completely different, it's just, and they would, more mainstream and more science oriented and it's like, and sometimes when people go from one to the other, they like the framing and their approach just is so different. Like there's very little way in which to bridge those. Yeah. So I feel like sometimes for those of us who moved in both of those worlds, if you can have conversations that authentically bridge those, but don't like abandon the presumptions of one for the other completely either, so so that people that matters, to know we can integrate some of these various worlds, and we can't, not perfectly, not like we're going to mush them together, but we can speak to them all. It's like, so if that makes sense, it's like I think, yeah. Anyway, that's important to me. I think
it's hugely important, and I sometimes think of it as a social manifestation of an inner capacity to do that same thing among our different subsystems. Like, can I go back and forth between my states of consciousness, or between my heart, mind, and body, or my left and right brain, and bring them together rather than hyper specializing in one of them, but kind of create a community of them.
Yeah. And I'm that, I wrote about it in Evolutionaries. I consider myself a generalist, and I know that sometimes generalists get a bad name in sort of modernist culture for good reasons sometimes, because I do feel you have to be an expert in at least 2, 3, 4 things before you know what it means to be an expert in something. Because otherwise you're just surfing you're just on top on a surface level. But if you know what it means to be an expert, and you know enough about certain topics, you can really engage them in interesting ways. And I feel it then being a generalist is rich, because you start to kind of cohere and put together things. And ultimately we are all by necessity generalist in our lives, in human culture. I mean, those breaks they only matter for these for universities or for certain disciplines. And look, if you want to go be a deep expert in something, more power to you. That's fantastic. We need that, but we also need the other, and it's underappreciated.
Yeah, there is a lot of professional exaltation of specialization, which is absolutely important to get things done.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, it's like you said, the most important thing there is you get a taste for what depth is, and a sense of what the skills are you need to find depth in any area. And then you can export that to other areas, because if you don't do that, then you can end up with, I think Jose Ortega y Gasset in The Revolt of the Masses talked about this, right? Like you have some elite specialists, and they seem to be really good at something. They're distinguished from the masses, but in every other area of their life, they have a much lower sensibility. So their overall effect and their participation in the world is at a much lower level. And we miss that because they're really advanced in one particular area.
Yeah. And that's kind of our method for giving people cultural weight is, okay, if you're a super expert in this area, then somehow you can, and you gain prominence in this area, then we'll allow you to speak about everything, which isn't always, I mean, sometimes that's fine, but it doesn't always work so well, because sometimes people start speaking about other areas and you're like, they have no idea. They've actually almost because they're so specialized and because they know so much about one area that they actually become kind of stupid about other areas. And that's unfortunate. It is unfortunate. You feel like
it's a weird version of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you have authentic capacity in one area that makes you feel like you're much smarter than you are in every other area.
Exactly. No, it's really true. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It's like, I feel that balance, understanding the generalist and specialist polarity is actually sort of important to be able to speak to some of the things. I saw this beautiful thing the other day I was listening to, and this is a podcast on investing I was listening to, and the guy I really like was talking about, he had this great line. He said, most people don't know how hard it is to know something, to really know something, and I just thought that's a beautiful thing to understand, because we can all be dilettantes. We can all assume we know something, but when you really know something, you know it in a different kind of way when you really get deep into it. And then you see people who don't know anything about that, really. And so I think you have to understand something about that to be a great generalist, ironically,
Yeah, you've got to be able, you have to be able to map the nuances of a zone really well. Even to the point where you come up against the spots where nobody knows the answer yet. Yeah. That's kind of how you
right.
When I've talked to people who are specialists in any domain, it's like one of the ways to get a good conversation is you let them know that you know what the outstanding problems in that domain are. Like what's the edge there? Yeah. At the same time, there's a real problem in just processing things. Like I always say, it's much more dangerous to drive to the airport than to be in the plane. But it doesn't feel that way, right? We have that piece of information, but we haven't really taken it on board. And it's so difficult to really take anything on board.
Yeah. You know, and also I feel like one of the things is really important is to, I feel like I'm good at this, and I don't know if that may just be that may be a feeling. I don't know. But if you know when you start to learn about a subject, you start to learn who you can trust in that subject, even if you aren't the super expert in that subject. You like learn enough you see the different people in that subject, the arguments they're having, and what they say about each other. And then you start to see, where are the sensibilities? What do I know about these arguments? And it's like, so you sort of, you also develop a selection of people, even if you're not going to stay involved in this subject for a long period.
Your go-to sources.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you feel like you've seen them be sensible, and I feel a little bit like that. Like examples like the world of energy, which I'm always been interested in a long time. I know a lot about it. People are always kind of surprised how much I know about it. I followed it very closely for 10 years. It's like I know, but it's not I don't have a PhD in it. I haven't studied it deeply for 20 years. That's not what I spend 8 hours a day doing. But I know a lot about it. But I've also developed 5, 6, 7 people in that world that I really trust, and that if I need to know something, I would go ask them about it, and they would tell me the issues involved, and they tell me these are what these people think, and these are what those people think, and so that's also part of, I think, how you develop a kind of a certain type of outsider expertise in the subject. You know enough about it that you know the issues involved, and you've developed relationships, or you develop enough awareness of the significant players in the field to learn who to trust. Now, I mean, you're always going to agree with those people, but that's important too. And it's hard. I think people have a hard time knowing who to trust these days. Like, I think that's a legit problem that people struggle with. It's like knowing how, it's just knowing who can I trust on these issues? Because I just feel the sort of traditional media, has gotten so fractured, and they have such, they have very strong points of view, not always wrong points of view. But like, if I read the New York Times on energy, or I read, they're going to have a point of view that they're pushing forward. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but in a way that maybe wasn't true 20 years ago. There's more of a point of view in any kind of media that's expressing itself. If I read the Wall Street Journal, if I read this, or National Review, so you got to know that a little bit as well. And it's hard for people to know who to trust that way, I think, understanding that. So
yeah, that's really tough. Like, you need a huge set of critical skills to be able to process information in an understood way, and nobody's really getting those skills.
I know, damn it. How do you do this? This is another thing. This is trying to provide. How do you provide those critical skills? People don't have them. They don't know how to think. And I think sometimes it takes 20 years of banging your head against the wall sometimes to even develop those kind of skills, So no, it's I
talk to people a lot about an excerpt from Richard Feynman's biography, where he talks about his dad taking him out in the woods and like explaining a lot of scientific detail about things and telling him the names of things in other languages, but not in English. So when he went to school, he sort of felt like he was behind everybody, but he ends up being one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, perhaps in part because he wasn't getting the labels and organizational categories. He was just getting the knowledge, but he had this sort of Taoist remove from the labeling system.
Right.
And that's I'm like, cool. Well, sure, the Tao you can speak is not the eternal Tao, but that was kind of a luxury item for people pursuing adepthood in the ancient world. Now it's sort of a survival necessity, because kids have to be learning right away that it's not necessarily true because you saw it, or you don't immediately clamp down on the obvious reaction to a piece of cultural content, because you're going to get 100,000 of them and they're all biased.
Yeah. No, it's so true. It's so true. It's a thing. I think, it's just the need for sort of cultural cultural educational awareness has never been greater. I don't know how to do that. If we need our educational system just seems to be an endless political battle now. So how do you do it? I mean, I don't have kids, but I don't know how, it's like that is more on the parents than ever in some way.
I think so. We've got 3 kids here, and we just have no confidence that the school system is going to provide it or that the media is going to provide it. Right? Yeah. They're going to provide a ton of things, but our sense is we need to be setting them up so they can process those things, which means not immediately taking them seriously or comparing them against other things or cross-checking and being in the right mode of being to handle information and supplementing it with other sources. And it's huge. But I think if it's not, it has to come from before the system of training. It's so true. I think that's right. It's so true. There has to be a kind of sensibility. And I always feel like, and for me, it's like, I always feel like one of the qualities I tried to, there's such a call in our political landscape to get caught in polarities, so, you just are gonna, this person said it, so it's my tribe. Therefore, it's like it's my tribe in some general way. So I'm going to believe this in some general way, and that is not all bad. Sometimes that can be fine. But, if you just allow yourself to like get carried along by the general political persuasion of your sort of general political leanings, you will end up doing stupid things, left or right or in the middle. It's like I do feel there's a way in which it takes some real independence not to get caught in political polarities, But political polarities these days cover a lot more than just politics. I mean, they seem to inform almost everything in the mainstream culture. So just not getting caught in those polarities takes some level of independence. It takes some level of just being able to say, okay, I can feel it myself sometimes. It's so easy. It's easier to just fall into that gravity well, it's like, that's one thing. There's people who win if you fall into that gravity.
Right? So like more success.
In the developmental context, you're like, why are so many people operating at this totalitarian, authoritarian team identity level?
Oh my God.
You're like, well, because the level above it to some degree makes money off that. They need predictable consumers. They need predictable voters. They need people who are going to identify with symbols in order to run the machine. So the machine wants there to be these people. And that's really hard to think about how you combat that.
Oh, it's so true. It's so true. Sometimes you think, I would be a lot more successful if I could just have that predictable response. And I just, and I wasn't subtly challenging all of my listeners in some way. That's like, sorry, and myself,
Well, they don't want to hear about both and on CNN.
No, it's so true. And then I feel the other challenge is like, when you move across certain worlds, and I always feel this is and especially when you move from modernist worlds into more esoteric worlds, and I always felt this when I was, certainly in more progressive spiritual worlds, there's a way in which when you cross those thresholds into those tribal contexts or those worldview contexts, you kind of want to there's this tendency to say, okay, we're in just a different epistemological context, so I'm going to sort of surrender all my skeptical modernist impulses in this world and just accept, and we can't entirely but we can't entirely do that either. It's like there's something about being able to embrace some of these more and certainly when you get into more esoteric dimensions, it's like on my show I'm going to have a couple people. I have people who are talking about different kinds of physics, and I may have some people talking about UFOs and different things like that, which I'm interested in a lot of that stuff. But some people, when they get into those realms, then they just abandon all their skepticism. They abandon they abandon a lot of that kind of just good old hard fashioned kind of skepticism, modernism. And you can't do that either. Somehow you can't do that either, but it's very tempting, it's like, and so, but if you're just skeptical, if you're just Neil deGrasse Tyson and I'm going to die on this hill, and thank God we have people like him in our culture, but he's not going to go one step out, philosophy. Nope. I'm not going to go one step,
The first move is to be able to go into these zones.
Yeah,
But then the
exactly.
second move is to sort of figure out how you cross-pollinate them with intelligence.
It's really true. And to being able to move across those thresholds into very interesting worlds, but being able to really keep your head about you as you do it. So you're open, you're really open-minded, but you're not open-minded. You're not stupid. It's like that. It sounds easy, but it's not. I think it's hard. And you're always trying to find that line. You're always trying to explore that. But a lot of people, they just say, okay, now I'm in this world and I'm going to surrender all my better judgment, just because I'm in this world now. And that's easy to do.
Well, let's talk about some of those worlds. I'm thinking about the weird in particular, because I was going through your podcast on Spotify, and it was interesting you mentioned your interest in electricity, because that's the one that stood out to me. I went in and I'm like, what is he talking about? The economics of electrical production in various parts of the world. And he seems like he's holding his own in this conversation. That's interesting. But you also got a number of things that, I mean, let's say science and spirituality, they're both somewhat respectable. But then the weird, the psychic, the UFOs, the strange, that's a really rich, interesting terrain that doesn't have the credibility of either science or spirituality in a lot of ways.
Right. You're right.
How long have you been interested in that? Is it, like for me, since boyhood, fascinated with that stuff, always trying to see if I could think more clearly about it. But what about you?
Same. A long time, always curious. I think I grew up always interested in, there was this kind of intermixing of the esoteric and the spiritual, and sometimes those intermix and sometimes they don't. And then I had a spiritual path in my 20s and 30s that really wasn't interested in the esoteric at all. We didn't really interface with it much in the path I was following. It wasn't really a big part of it. But I was always curious, and I stayed curious. I read widely in those areas. And, when I was first on, again, going back to what is Enlightenment magazine, like the first few articles I wrote, I remember the first couple long articles I wrote were on, I wrote this article about, it's kind of a silly article, but it was fun, called In Search of Babaji, which was like this kind of weird esoteric landscape that kind of just strange. And then I wrote another one on messianic movements in both traditional religion and in postmodern worlds. And that was also fascinating. I learned a lot about the world of messianic movements, and it's kind of wild. And also the way religious culture and postmodern culture mirrors each other in that respect, and just religious culture in general. But I was always particularly interested. I was always curious about UFOs and that world. And I read enough in those worlds to know that something was going on that we couldn't sort of grasp as a civilization and as a society yet. And it was real, but we couldn't wrap our minds around it. And the deeper I got, and you read about the abduction stuff and all of that stuff, and it's like the deeper I got into that, and I used to get books every day sent to me and all this stuff. And, at a certain point, you just like, it's hard. It's very hard to, this is true with spiritual experience, true. And it's true with esoteric experience. It's very hard to separate. You never can entirely, but you have to make the effort to separate people's experience from the interpretation of their experience. It's like you can't entirely separate those. They cross, but you also have to make some effort. It's like you can't just your interpretive framework can't just overwhelm your experience. So you just interpret it however you want to based on your own kind of view of the world. You have to make some effort to be a little bit separate those. And I just feel I would get the fact
that you can't perfectly disentangle them doesn't mean you can't do it better.
Oh my God. And it's true with sometimes with spiritual experience, people say, well, I had this experience. I would say, just tell me what happened. Then we can talk about what it means, the interpretive structure, but what happened? Sometimes it's very hard to get at what happened. It's like, what happened? Well, I had this type of experience and then I interpret it this way. No, they just tell you their interpretation as if that's what happened.
That's one reason it's really difficult to gauge where somebody is at through verbal testing. right?
Yeah.
Because our ability to know what we experienced and then also to articulate it to someone else, that varies wildly. Most people are not very good observers, as anybody who has witnesses in a criminal case knows that, right?
Yeah,
It's
right.
really
Right.
hard to say exactly what you experienced.
Yeah, it's so true. It's really true. I can't. It's just, and so I noticed that early on, and even with, again, both esoteric experience and spiritual experience, and I felt like I would get all these books about all this esoteric high strangeness and abductions and UFOs and all. And at a certain point, I was very curious, and I knew there were serious people in the field, and I tried to read those people, and I tried to understand what was happening, and at a certain point, I just got kind of frustrated with it all. I just like, it's like, yes, I don't know where to take this. And especially around the UFO thing is like, something's going on there. It has a significance across culture. There's some physical phenomenon that people are experiencing and witnessing. And there's too much of it by credible people to dismiss it all as just irrelevant and made, kind of mistaken identities and just, it's just too much of it. And I can come up with lots of ideas that I think about it, but what do you do about it? So anyway, so I sort of put it aside, but I'd step back in every so often to try. And also a lot of the people in those fields, sometimes you can tell they know something and they've experienced something. Sometimes they've had real experience, but then you read them, you just go, oh God, I don't know. It's like, so there are definitely a lack. There aren't enough really credible people who can also refrain from just drinking the Kool-Aid entirely, and just going deep in that, so that also, it's like, it sort of self-selects for people, and who maybe naturally will get drawn into those areas of esoteric stuff, but then it's very hard for them to keep their head about them. Anyway, so all of those issues, and yet there's interesting things there. But what happened for me also, this is more recently, and particularly around the UFO phenomenon, I was invited to a conference. Jeffrey Kripal, the religious studies professor at Rice. Great. So Jeff is great, and I followed his work for a long time, and I met him before, and we'd sort of had a back and forth for a number of years. And I read his great book, Mystics and Mutants, which is such a great book.
Yeah.
And he invited me to a conference at Esalen about 4 years ago. Now, this is before the New York Times I think it was right before the New York Times did their article. And it was about all of this UFO esoteric phenomenon. And Jacques Vallée was there. And for listeners who don't know who Jacques Vallée is, he's like the gold standard of research in this area. And, Whitley Strieber was there. And a lot of just really interesting people, David Metcalf, Greg Bishop, some really interesting people were there. Gary Nolan from Stanford, who's doing some of the geneticists, who's doing some research on this. And it sort of, I suddenly realized, there is new stuff happening here that I haven't been in this field for a while. And I got to, so I spent 3 days with those guys. Eric Wargo was there. And I started, it kind of reawakened some of my interest in that field. And then when the New York Times did their article on the UFOs, that sort of became this cultural moment. And now it seems like every few days there's some new revelation about it. And yeah, there's still the skeptics, and that's fine. But we seem to be in a new moment here. And there's an acknowledgement in a way I think there wasn't 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that this physical phenomenon of UFOs kind of sort of intermixes with more esoteric phenomenon and crosses over with consciousness in interesting ways, and we don't really understand it. And there's so much there to dig into. It's a very rich world right now, and in some ways, I think it may end up being I could see this being a significant new life condition of the culture in the next 10 years. We might realize things about this area that really kind of change our perception of our place on the planet, our place in, as humans, that could be important, that could be significant. And I think we can't overlook that now. We have to take this seriously. I think real, actual mainstream researchers really need to take this seriously. I don't think that they've adjusted yet, but people are starting to kind of say, oh my God, what does this mean? And so it's important to get out ahead of that, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. It's and again, that comes back to how hard it is to viscerally take something as being real when
Yeah.
you're encountering it. But it makes, I mean, on the one hand, there's this, hey, maybe we're going to discover a new thing about the world. Maybe there's another dimension, or maybe whatever we called elves and aliens are real, and now they look like
Yeah.
UFOs.
Angels,
Or
elves,
maybe there's
fairies,
actual
aliens.
visitors
Right.
from outer space, or maybe
Yeah.
there's
Right.
super secret technology. So all of those I go, okay, if it was that, then I got it. But
Right.
some of it is like, it seems like it undoes our basic categories of what's inside and outside, or hallucinated, or real, or material, or non-material.
I know
And
that's true.
that is really intriguing. That's like an iceberg that our Titanic is crashing into in my mind. And
Yeah, right.
I think about the strangeness in the culture. Like I think about, Trump in a way was like a shaman in my mind, like not a good shaman or a healthy shaman,
No, you're
but
right.
a guy who came stumbling back into the village covered in ash from the graveyard and creeped you out and spoke in nonlinear ways. And people are going, yeah, I might want that in charge right now, because the chiefs haven't been handling the situation well. And we're going to need somebody who looks like they might be able to reconfigure reality. Right. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think the world is getting weirder? Like, are we crashing into that uncertainty about the very categories of reality so much that we're looking to these things and going, we need to know more about whatever that is, whatever doesn't fit our categories?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that I do think Trump, in a way, was the first. I always call him the first postmodern president, really, in the sense that he broke outside like some of the categories that sort of the post-war modernism had set in place, and he kind of like, he came in at a different level and sort of, like you say, represented sort of the instincts and the id of the culture in some ways, and sort of channeled them into a presidency for worse in many ways, I think, and maybe for better in other ways. Broke up things, broke up a lot. Now that's dangerous. That's a dangerous moment, and we're in a dangerous moment, I think, because I always say, be careful what you break is one of my lines, because people are like, oh yeah, let's burn it down, let's break it up. It's how this is all those old things, these old structures, these old institutions. They're sclerotic. They don't make sense. They don't serve us. They suck. Let's do it. Let's remake it. It's like we're in this moment. It's like I do feel like, maybe it's 70 years from World War II. We just don't understand how hard it is to build things that actually have work even a little bit, with that work. And so we're so anxious to break things down. And I think that makes a very dangerous moment when you do that. And when you have this and we're in this kind of postmodern moment, in the sense that not only from a kind of the social justice side of it, I think we forget the other side of it, which is we're breaking those categories of reality that we've had for a number of years. And this is another way in which we're undermining all those categories. Now, the opportunity there is to enlarge our view of the world, to move forward, and people feel that need. They feel we're breaking against those boundaries. We need to enlarge our view of the world. We can improve the world if we do that. And yes, we can. And that's powerful, but we need to be very smart about how we do that, because when you're overconfident about breaking things, sometimes you can't put things back together. That being said, I do think that there is all these UFOs is one of these weird ways in which it's sort of it's cutting at those foundations and undermining our sense of some of those very traditional categories of how we make meaning even at an institutional and political level. It's like, what's going to come out and what's it going to mean and how are people going to relate to it? It's clear that there's more going on here than has been. And I'm one of these guys who I'm very anti-conspiracy, like I think most conspiracies, are sort of, even when they're conspiracies, they're kind of accidental conspiracies mostly, they're kind of fuck ups, not conspiracies, it's like, but there are exceptions. And I think this is probably, I don't believe in big conspiracies or some, but it's clear that there's more going on than we've been told. And what that looks like, we don't know exactly, but that's going to further sort of undermine and change the way we organize reality. And like you say, there's a level of, there's a level of kind of like, they call high strangeness, weirdness, this esoteric worlds that have sort of, we've sort of in the culture, we've we put spiritual experience and esoteric experience together like this, and they're almost two separate, they interpenetrate, but they're also kind of separate things. And all, and drug experience also is in there in that mix, and and I just think it's interesting that all of those things are sort of forcing us out of our normal categories. And I forgot what the point I was going to bring all this together, but I just think it's a really interesting time, because it is kind of, it's, these have always existed. This has always existed in these little pockets of culture, but it's forcing its way into all of culture. And we never had that. We've never had that. And that's going to change things.
It's this notion of being careful what you break is really interesting, because there's a tension there we're all trying to solve somehow, which is, it is very hard to build things up. And if you break them down, you usually get something worse and more primitive and just have to rebuild them again. However, a lot of the things we built are leading us to a dangerous cliff at a very high speed. So some of the things that are working have to be radically changed very quickly. And we're not sure exactly which way to go on which piece of the system. It's
a big thing. This is conscious evolution in a nutshell, right? I mean, in a way, because when you break things unconsciously, is like you say, often they get worse. And yet we have to move forward. We have to break some things. We have to evolve some of our institutions. We have to move forward. And so we need to be able to break things while evolving them. But if we just break things unconsciously and kind of in a reactionary way, that's a challenge. You might get something a lot better in 100 years. It's like, but I don't want to live in the in-between time. It's like World War II was, and the Great Depression, everything that happened, it wasn't very fun. And we got something a lot better. We broke that whole system and we ended up getting something a lot better. But there's no guarantee of that. And I don't really want to have to go through that interim period. And that interim period may be a lot longer this time. So how do we break? That's the essence of like, how do we evolve without? As I say, how do we initiate an evolutionary process without? Because in the past, what we've depended upon culturally is a revolutionary process, and kind of just you break everything, you have a revolution, and you hope it gets better, and every once in a while it does, but not always, and not immediately, and yet that process of cultural evolution is what we have to transcend now, or it's just too dangerous. I think we've got to get better at like being able to move forward the sclerosis of cultural institutions and structures that have to evolve, but you can't but burning them down and hoping that something new comes. And because I've got the best idea, well, you may, but it won't matter. It's like
so risky. I mean, it's I don't know how you actually pronounce it, Scylla and Charybdis, where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because revolutionary breakdown is too dangerous right now. But incremental change that allows business as usual to continue is equally or more dangerous. So we can't slip into either of those grooves. That's a very narrow track to have to steer.
Yeah. And you can see as these postmodern waves hit the culture, like from an integral view, these postmodern waves are hitting the culture, these new life conditions, watching the social justice stuff hit the culture and change things, good and bad in different ways. Right. And, and some of the environmental stuff, obviously those are life conditions that are going to, however we see those, a lot of those are hitting the culture and they're going to change how we see things. And I think some of this esoteric stuff also is kind of hitting the culture at a deeper level and undermining some of those traditional ways of making meaning and changing the way we think about the world. And who knows where we're going with this UFO stuff. That may be a significant life condition to contend with, understanding our place in the universe in a different way, or on the planet. Doesn't have to be aliens, but it could change the way we see ourselves. And you need people. You do feel like we need to be able to shepherd ourselves through this in some kind of way that's a little more conscious than we've been, because it's very hard to just go back. That's the thing. You can't just, oops, let's go back. It was pretty good in 1980 in certain ways. We're not going to be able to do that. It's just a different era. And so there's just, we can't go back to the 50s. We can't go back to the 80s. We can't go back to whenever. And so, but we can't abandon, I do feel we can't abandon our kind of good modernism either. We can't just rush headlong into some, as I say in my latest article, if we try to replace our modern world with some postmodern idea about how the future will be better, we will end up in some Manichaean nightmare. We have to build on top of what's come before. We can change it, but we got to build on top of it too.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's a certain way that postmodernism is used in the culture. It points out some interesting features, and there's some problematic aspects to it. But when we think in terms of, the developmental holarchy kinds of models, it's only postmodern if it's also modern. Right? Otherwise, It's not really postmodern, because it doesn't go A, B, it goes A and B, A and B and C,
Right. Exactly.
We're looking for real postmodernism here.
Yeah. No, right. Exactly. One that actually builds on top of it. Right. Exactly. No, that's critical. And we forget that sometimes. And
there's what you were saying about this interim period. We're racing into a very uncertain interim period of an unknown duration and an unknown scale of transformation. And it's very unknown how bad it might get. We have some guesses and we have some trend lines that say, even if we made big changes right now, it's probably still going to accelerate into a very bad interim period on a lot of vectors. So how do you personally juggle optimism and intentional evolution and getting involved and organizing things and listening to people and being involved in projects, but also taking really seriously that a lot of this isn't going to work, and we're past a lot of our markers already? How do we take the problem seriously such that we're moved to try to do things, and how do we take it seriously such that we don't just naively think there's hope? Because we have kids here and they'll go, what? They make jokes like they've only got 30 years left or the oceans are dying, right? And as an adult, you want to leap in and be like, no, you've got lots of possibilities. Then you go, maybe I shouldn't tell them that. Maybe we should all just sit with this.
See, it's a big question these days, right? And I'm of the opinion, it's a good question. But I'm of the opinion that we have to, I know the hip way to be now is to be optimistic, but really pessimistic in the short term. It's I think Jeremy Johnson was using a name for this the other day. It was doomer optimism or something. I think it was or something. I can't remember. It's we have doom in the short term, but I'm optimistic long term. And I understand the sensibility there, I get it, but we have to be careful there, because there's a religious notion there that we have to pay for our sins,
right? And
then we'll be redeemed. It's kind of a millennialist, and the millennialism, that traditional, messianic idea in traditional culture, and postmodern culture mirrors traditional culture so strongly. And so the tendency in postmodern culture is to have that, pay for our sins, and then we'll be liberated. It's then we'll come on the other side. And is it real? I think it's a dangerous way to think about the future. And and we forget how religious it is in a certain way, even if it's secular in this context, it's still religious. And especially around environmentalism and the sort of a lot of the environmental sensibilities of the day, they take on those religious undertones. We have that paying for our sins. We even have a Virgin Mary and Greta, so we have to be careful about that, I think. So the answer is, we don't know the future. We know it could be disrupted in all kinds of ways, right? But I feel like we have to maintain we have to keep speaking integrally and speaking from cultural developmental levels, we have to keep our grounded in a kind of modernist optimism about our capacity to build that world in better and better, right? while being informed by all of these concerns and real concerns, not closing our eyes to them, being awake, but not letting ourselves get pulled into that gravity of the either of what I was just saying, or just the feeling that there's no hope, that the future is kind of, that sort of the postmodern sense of the future being inevitably compromised in some fundamental way, that feeling that, it's never going to be as good, or I think we have to resist that. I think we have to stay grounded in a sense that, for all kinds of reasons, partially because I think we have to acknowledge that has been, many of the worst predictions about where we're going haven't always proven to be true. Yeah. Humans can be resourceful. We can do all kinds of things. Now, anyway, it's a longer conversation about how we deal with the environmental messages. But I resist getting. I feel like we have to try to get to a more integral view where we acknowledge all those issues that we're going to have to struggle with, and we acknowledge that we're maybe in a different era of how culture evolves, but we maintain enough healthy modernism in there that we have a sense that the future can still be bright, even if it's challenging. We have and we have the energy to do what we need to build forward, because there's a lot we need to do, and if we allow that energy to get sapped by a kind of a feeling of hopelessness, I just feel that can't help it doesn't help anyone, and I feel like then it'll be a self-creating thing where eventually we'll have to find that energy again anyway to build wherever we need to go, so anyway, that's my sense.
Yeah, that's terrific. It makes me think of, I was asked to write an article on hope for a revision a while back. And what I ended up writing was kind of two things. And one was, you got to hope on purpose. It's got to be intentional, like a Buddhist feeling practice. You're like, okay, I'm not going to watch the news and see if they're telling me a reason for hope or despair. I'm going to choose hope. So there's that half. But then there's also, I go deep into Nietzsche, and his first book on the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music involved his sense that the pre-Socratic Greeks were a very pessimistic culture, and yet they produced all of the things that sort of spawned out into Western civilization, right? And like every one of their great plays and works of art was about the hero fails and dies and is doomed, right? They had all these myths. The king captures the satyr and asks him the secret of what's the best thing in life? He says, never to have been born. But what's the second best thing? To die young, right? And you're like, these people were morose, but they were super productive in building up civilization. So there's also a way in which hopelessness can give you energy as well.
Maybe so. That's interesting. I love that. Well, I think that's also reflective of life at the time, right? I mean, I think we forget, Athens was this little beautiful island in a sea of probably suffering, there wasn't a lot of, that history of culture is not, at that era, it doesn't give you a lot of reasons probably for optimism. But I think that we often say that history of culture doesn't give us a lot of reason for optimism, it seems like. But then I think, well, actually, look, we could go through 100 years of whatever, or 1,000, or 5, but all kinds of things can happen and could. But, I still think a developmental reading of history gives you reason for tremendous optimism, ultimately. But you won't. But you need energy for that, and I just feel you need some of that energy. It's like, how do we have that kind of optimism? We can build better. We can actually build better. That's not just stuck in some modernist denial, right? But is not captured by a postmodern pessimism. It's like
I think that dovetails with the post-progressive stuff. I think probably what Nietzsche would have said is, where were they getting that energy then? They were getting that energy from the Dionysian festivals, from the things they do that brought them together, right?
It was the drugs. We're looking at drugs. It was the good psychedelics.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry.
Although it's probably like, I always think, we think, the orgiastic rituals of the ancient world. And we're picturing like people naked at a Led Zeppelin concert with a head full of acid. And they're probably got like one jug of weak wine that they're able to make or something like that. You go to see the shaman, you think he's going to blow your mind, and he gives you one puff of tobacco, and you're like, maybe I was exaggerating how crazy this was. Anyway, my point was, something about the way people came together was giving them this energy, right?
Yeah.
And so there's the same thing in the political sense of, unless you get a transpartisan or trans level or trans categorical ethos of people working together, generating some extra coherence, they're not going to have the spirit to share with each other. And that spirit is a way of talking about whether they're energized. Do they feel like the civilization they're in is holy enough to put any effort into?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I just, that's beautiful. That's beautifully said. And look, there's a million problems, but I just can't get we got to be we got to work. We got to be optimistic. We got to believe in the future. We got to have faith in the future, right? That's the Teilhardian thing. I'm not blind faith, not stupid faith, but the doomism, I just can't get there. I just feel I don't see what purpose it serves. I mean, I know, like I see some of the, our job now is to mourn the earth. I just really, that's it. And yeah, okay. I mean, most environmental trends are better, except for climate, except for carbon, and I know that one could lead to all kinds of issues in the future, but there are ways. You already see the solutions. Now I know we baked a lot into the cake, but you start to also see the solutions, how we can move forward, how we can move out of this. I find I know some people just will disagree with me and feel like I'm being naive, but
what are the major solutions when you look into the future and go, oh, here's a plausible scenario for civilization success over the next 100 years? What are your touchstones on that? Where do you think of this could work?
In what areas?
Like
you mean
in any areas, in terms of keeping the planet and human civilization, increasing well-being rather than radically decreasing its well-being?
Well, I mean, I think for all of our troubles, right? For all of the problems, we've lifted people out of poverty for the last 100 years, last 200 years. We've created a global middle class. We've created we've lifted, an incredible amount of people in Asia out of, economically, you start to see, okay, put aside environmental, right? Economically, you see, we could all get to a place where essentially we had dealt with the extreme forms of poverty were dealt with, right? You could start to see a place where you had a kind of, most everyone was near middle class or being supported in some kind of way. I mean, we haven't got there as a society here, but we're close. The Western, they have other problems. I mean, there's other reasons why people fall through that safety net. And those are their own problems we have to deal with. But you start to see, we all could get to that level of wealth and success. It doesn't mean there's not going to be significant societal problems. There are, but you could get to that. Then you have to deal with, okay, what's the energy cost of that? What's the carbon footprint of that, right? How do we do that? We need energy to do that. Can we do that in a way that is free of the carbon footprint that will create all these problems? So like that. And there are ways to do that. I think we're discovering them. There's a lot of new technology that we can, I think, over time, potentially decarbonize our transportation infrastructure. How do we decarbonize the rest of our energy infrastructure? I think there's, some mixture of renewables, of nuclear, of low carbon technologies could radically bring it down and without reducing our footprint. And then we have to figure out how to thrive as a large society in a way where with a much lower carbon footprint, with without the demographic dividend of a growing population, which we're going to lose. The population, I think, is probably going to peak, in the next few decades and then start to go down. We've rarely lived on a planet that's had a population that's lowering. So there's going to be all kinds of new challenges, and obviously that we're probably going to be in a warming planet in various ways, but a wealthier planet and a planet where, I want to get to that point where you start to see that possibility where people say, we could get there. We could get to a way where most people are taken care of. Most people can have a life where they can potentially choose to thrive, where some of the some of the tribal and cultural and racial issues of the past have mostly been solved.
Yeah.
And then the environmental footprint is starting to come down without compromising our quality of life and the ability to not live in poverty and that kind of whatever poor, I can't remember whose statement about the nasty, brutish, and short. Right, exactly. So you see that, and I just feel like I could see in the next 3-4 decades, you start to see that possibility that we could get there.
Yeah.
And that to me is like, that's a beautiful thing if we could get there. Now it may involve a lot of mitigation of the climate consequences, but who's to say that's not possible, that we can mitigate that while our carbon footprint comes down. Maybe it will involve some kind of over the long run, I could see it involving some kind of geoengineering. That may be a much longer term, or maybe not. I don't know. But I just feel that I don't see why that isn't as likely as the major pessimistic scenarios.
Yeah.
I really don't. I don't feel like I'm being naive. I feel like I'm being pretty honest about where we are. And I listen to the pessimists. I read them. I listen to them. I take in what they say. And I just don't feel that's the inevitable outcome here. And
looks to me like the material, the objective side makes all of this stuff really feasible. And that the source of a lot of people's pessimism is coming from the sociological side. We have a lot of solutions to our problems and a lot of tools for doing them. But when we look, we go, is it plausible that the social apparatuses we have will take action at scale and fast enough to mitigate the really bad versions of the change? But we all know we could totally fix this stuff.
Yeah.
So we're looking at, are we likely to? You're like, that's where everybody's really uncertain and really anxious, because we just see the evidence of inadequate social change procedures coming at us from every direction.
Well, no doubt. I mean, that's another issue. I mean, well, it's not another issue, but it's a real issue, I guess. But yeah, definitely. But and I think sometimes it also can seem like, God, we're so fucked, in the way our political structures are unable to deal with this in so many ways. But then sometimes also 20 years later, something you never thought would change is complete, something happened and you've been able to completely shift it. What if lab grown meat was ultimately more tastier than regular meat, and we in the next 3 decades we took our carbon footprint of animal agriculture to a quarter of what it is now, or a tenth of what it is now. I mean, maybe that's not going to happen. I don't know, but things like that can surprise out of nowhere, right? And so you rewild, another quarter of the planet doing it, or something like that. All kinds of interesting things can happen that I feel like we have to. I mean, you're living 250 years ago. You never see what's coming. You have no idea what's coming. In 1750, you cannot see the world of 1950, 1950. It's like, and that's a blink of an eye in terms of human evolution, right? Like the possibilities that are suddenly available for life in 1950 as opposed to 1750. And the way in which we move and travel and interact, and just the kind of ways in this conversation, anything like that. I mean, that's 200 years, it's not very long. And I just feel like we forget that. We forget that so much can change. It's so easy to be, pessimistic based on our extrapolation of our sense of the present to the future. And that's just even more so when the mood of the time is so, I just feel, like maybe the 1950s when everyone was optimistic and we're going to build the world and we're going to have flying cars and everything's going to be great. We're going to live in the Jetsons. Maybe it was worth questioning whether or not that was going to be entirely true, whether or not we were going to quite do that. But now I feel like the opposite is true. Like maybe it's worth questioning whether or not the only future is a dystopian nightmare. The Blade Runner is the only future possible.
Well, I really enjoyed your talk with Avi Tushman on sort of Wikipedia as a model for generating sense-making mechanisms in the digital age, because I think a lot of the pessimism comes out of an anxiety that's based on the fact that we're interacting with the world in a way that it's just very difficult to make coherent sense of it. Right. So we're not sure, we're not getting the data properly. We don't know what's true or false, and everything is overwhelming. And, for a lot of people, the idea that we could collectively get our hands on a better map of reality that was realistic enough to act on seems so far from them now that they don't trust solutions, because that would be required for any general solutions to be implemented.
Yeah. I think that's a good description. The dislocation of our current moment, where people end up throwing up their hands. I don't know what to think, or I don't know, it's all that's kind of a function of a culture in which information has become, which we disconnected like narrative and reality. It's like it's just narratives. It's just information. It's like what relationship it has to reality, I have no idea. It's like, and I do think we've snipped that connection, and it messes with people when we do that. And so people need to get we need people who can reconfigure that connection from a higher ground. Otherwise, it kind of it makes the mood of the times, even if it's not apocalyptic, it seems like, it's like that great Nietzsche line where he said, "What were we thinking when we unchained this earth from its sun?" Yeah. And that feeling, where are we drifting now into endless nothingness, I think is his line. And that the existential feeling of just endless surfaces makes us, it creates a kind of a pessimistic mood or a existential angst mood. So we have to kind of reknit the reality together in some way. And we need modern shamans who can do that in ways that are real, in ways that aren't just retrenchments, So.
Okay, well, let's pivot from the metacrisis. See what else we can talk about. I'm really interested in the overlap between different higher and deeper discourse communities. And so, like, if I go like, hey, I'm going to have Jordan Gruber on to talk about his book on the plural selves, I'm like, that's one thing. But then if I see him on Jim Rutt and I see him on Carter Phipps, I think, oh, maybe this is something. Maybe we're all picking up on something here.
Right.
And I'm curious about that one specifically. Like, what's your sense of the notion of the self being deeply plural, right? Do you experience yourself as a community? Do you think there's a plurality waiting to be unified, or that it's always going to be plural, or that deep underneath there's a spiritual unified individuality, or, what's your sense of all that?
I love Jordan. Jordan's a friend, and I enjoyed that interview. And I think he's on to something, but he draws conclusions maybe that I don't go as far as he does. I see it was very liberating in my own development as a self, as Carter, to recognize that there are parts of ourselves that have almost their own psycho-emotional dramas that play out in your consciousness, and that I can become something else temporarily, and that can play out. And to let that be, to not be overwhelmed by it, to not have to push it outside of the barrier of self, so you don't have to deal with it, right? That we are composed, that we do contain these multitudes of these, psycho-emotional complexes that can overwhelm us at different times. and that also probably connect to deeper layers of the collective unconscious, right? And to noetic and to the noosphere in various ways, right? And are influenced by it. So allowing all of that into myself and acknowledging it and being able to be okay about it and see it and understand and like live with it was hugely important in my development as my own psychological and spiritual development. But that doesn't mean I don't have an individuated sense of self either. Yeah. Right? That individuated sense of self doesn't have to be in opposition to all of that. It doesn't have to be narrow. It doesn't have to be little. It doesn't have to be brittle. It can be, but there's still that kind of executive function, that I think is important. And I see that. So I don't just see it as a multitude without a center. To me, there can be a real center. That it's a little bit like, David Eagleman likes to talk about the CEO of a corporation. All kinds of things are going to be happening. There's still an executive function at the center. And I think that's more how I see the self and how I experience myself. So I'm not a pluralism in search of a center, in search of a self. I'm more of a self with a multitudes that are all part of the picture, but don't define Carter either, if that makes sense, right?
Nice.
But it's beautiful. There's something about, like, I honestly think, like, it's a developmental achievement. I don't know, maybe, but it's a developmental step to be able to let it's like when you take drugs or something. It's the more obvious example. If you do psychedelics, they overwhelm your system and you almost become someone else. And then you go back to being you, but in some ways, being able to let ourselves embody a whole different psycho-emotional intentional worlds without thinking that need be us or need entirely be us is incredibly important. Because if we can't do that, we'll get into a reaction with those worlds, those interior worlds. And then that will define who we are one way or the other, right? So allowing that, letting it be, right? They'll meditate. That's the beauty of meditation too, right? Letting it be, not having to have it be me or not be me. Now, it doesn't have to be me or not be me is really important,
Yeah, it's at least, the plural self is at least heuristically and therapeutically valuable. Maybe it's more than that, but it's at least that.
Yeah.
And there's definitely something that allows the plurality to exist and seems to be perhaps even intensified when different selves are in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, right.
And whether that's primal and basic or new and emergent, it's hard to say, but there's something going on there and I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful thing to let ourselves be as wide as it needs to be, It's like, but without having to define ourselves so clearly, or without having to but this is where I go a little bit different in Jordan, without having to also undefine myself because of it. It's like I can still be me, but all this can be real.
What about what podcasts do you listen to and appreciate? Either in terms of content or in terms of style. Who do you think's doing a good job out there that you go to for to drink?
It's a great question. I confess I'm new to podcasts, so I'm still exploring those worlds, and I haven't got very far enough. I'll say sometimes on certain subjects I'll listen to, like maybe on energy, I'll listen to certain people, or like a UFOs. I have a couple that I listen to if I want to keep up in those esoteric worlds a little bit. I want to keep up. I have a couple who I listen to. But one of the more general interest podcasts I love is a podcast called Hidden Forces. Dimitri something, I can't remember his last name. And it's a little bit more of an investing podcast. I mean, I must admit, I love markets and I love investing and I love economics. So those podcasts I'm drawn to. partially because I think also some of the, in my generation, weirdly enough, and in our generation, some of the smartest people in who arose in culture went into finance. So now as they get into their late 40s and 50s, and they're more commentating on the culture more, and they're interesting people in those worlds, I think. But Hidden Forces is very interesting. He's a very interesting guy, and he's tracking some very interesting territory, not integral in the way that we're talking about it, but thoughtful. And he's really trying not to fall into certain narratives and just be a voice of that narrative. People end up falling into a narrative and they become a voice of that narrative, and he's trying not to do that. And he's tracking almost kind of pseudo integral territory, and he's worth listening to, and he has an interesting guest on, but it's more of an economics focus. So that's,
I don't know if, maybe you're not broadly sampled in podcasts enough to answer.
No, I'm really not. It's pathetic.
I'm also curious about your sense of the aesthetics, and maybe this would relate to your own show, but for me, because I talk to so many people now who are doing these projects, there's a very clear divide between, let's be more professional, let's be more clean and clear and have it be shiny and accessible and do it like we're really doing it, versus a lot of other people, especially younger people, go, no, there's something ragged and amateurish about this that's intrinsic, right? It's good when the cat walks in front of your computer and makes it real. And that's what we're looking for in a podcast, So I'm like,
what do you think? This is talk about plurality of selves. Yeah. This is where my plural selves get all mixed up.
I'm torn as well. Like the amateurish thing, I think that's true, and I think it's going to drift further in that direction, especially because that's what I'm hearing from everybody who's younger, and so that's what's going to happen. It's going to be them finding the aesthetics. And even when I do like my faux announcery introduction stuff, people are like, yeah, you're being too professional. I'm like, am I? Because I feel like I don't know. For me, it really depends on who I'm talking to, right? If I'm talking to somebody that I'm trying to be careful with, then I'm more professional. But if I'm talking to somebody I'm really relaxed with, then maybe I'm taking my shirt off during the interview. I want to be able to span all those options personally.
I find this hard. It's fair enough. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So this is a real question for me, and I find it hard even when I'm being interviewed. Sometimes I feel like, I had this book, Conscious Leadership, come out, and I did about 30 podcasts, and I felt like I was always trying to kind of, sometimes I'm being a little more formal, and trying to, hit the points I want to say about the book. And then every once in a while, I kind of let myself go and just being very kind of informal in a way that's also nice. And I try to feel, is that the best way? Sometimes I find I'm trying. And so here's the answer to that in the podcast. I had the same thing. People would tell me you shouldn't read your intro. And I said, I don't know if it's so good if I don't read it or something like that. I need something. Also I came out of a media context that I was trained in, where we were very curated. It was very curated, carefully written, interviews that were carefully curated. And so there's something about me that also likes the deep curation of it, the putting it together. Yeah. Like also because as a writer, there's something about like capturing the nuance of the rhythm and the kind of flowing from ideas and the way ideas intermix and creating that idea cake that bakes together perfectly, that you can't do if it's just, and I love, and that's something you can only do if it's really thought through and careful. So like half of me wants to do like a podcast that's like beautifully edited and curated and like just put together, where it's like a show on Broadway or something. Half of me wants to do that, and the other half just wants to get on and talk to people. And it's like, and I feel like that's the way I should do it.
How much time and energy do I even have for any of this?
Exactly.
Right. Like I used to,
it's hard enough.
I was doing a local radio show here, which and then COVID hits, right? So you can't go into the studio, so you can keep making episodes from home. So now I'm working the audio software and piecing things in, and I'm writing it out, and it's taking up more and more of my time until I finally go, I can't do this show.
It's so
and
true.
The way I would love to do it is going to take my whole week. I'm going to get nothing done. I really need to be able to just sit down and talk to somebody and see where it goes and then be done.
Oh, it's so true. It is so true. I couldn't agree more. It's so true. It's like trying to get to that point. No, at a certain point, you're like, I gotta get, can I even get a show out this week at all? And much less do it in the way that in some part of my mind, I would love to create it, and at a certain point, I haven't even listened to it again, but I hope it was good. It's like,
who would you love to interview?
Well, it's not so much a person, but here's what I'm always worried about. And this, I'm sure I over worry about this. I'm always worried about that. I interview one person in this subculture, and then someone in that subculture is not going to want to talk to me. It's like, because you cross those worlds. Someone's going to say, who is this guy talking about UFOs? I don't want to have a conversation with him, or vice versa. Or this guy's interviewing all these economists, and, it's not really, I mean, of course, naturally, I have this background in the spiritual progressive world. So I know all those people. So I can have, I know Deepak. Deepak came on and we have a conversation. He's much less harder for me to get. I've talked to some people like, you got Deepak Chopra on. That's incredible. It's like, well, no, it's not. That's easy for me to get him on. It's harder to get, whatever the chairman of the Federal Reserve or something. I don't know, whatever. But, not that I'm going to get him, but, it's harder to get someone a little bit more deeply steeped in a more conventional world. So I want to be able to get some of those people on as well. And part of that's just becoming successful enough. That's the other piece of it. It's like, success trumps a lot of those issues. So it's not so much an individual person. It's just, I want to be able to get whoever the fuck I want to be able to get. That's what I want to be.
Anybody in any domain.
Exactly. I want to be big enough that they have to come on, I guess that's what Joe Rogan has, right?
Yeah, that's that Rogan level for sure. He's been a real pioneer in just being willing to go into every kind of conversation. I really admire that about him.
No, I agree. That's where he's been a little bit like that, right? Exactly. I feel like he's an interesting model in that. So I don't know what the level is that you had to be able to get that, but
he also shows,
Also, he's done a lot to bring the UFO conversation. I mean,
yeah,
because he interviewed all those guys.
Analytically dissect a lot of the categories. Like even when I'm like, the post-progressive thing, I'm looking at the four. I'm like, are they? Because aren't all four really within each world? So then I'm like, I'm going to need 4 dimensions in order to map this out, right? And then I end up saying things like, the conservative and liberal versions of the progressive, and people are like, what do you mean conservative progressives? Like, who are these? Who are these right-wing progressive you're talking about? I'm like, maybe Joe Rogan is a good example of that because he's with Bernie Sanders on almost every major social and economic proposal. But he's also talking to right wingers and bow hunting, and he's more focused on individual autonomy and staying healthy, and sort of leans into that Jordan Peterson space. And I'm like, okay, is that conservative green? That's neat.
There is a green sensibility. Like there's a kind of half libertarian, individual autonomy focused, but culturally postmodern. Yeah. In the sense that they've embraced all of those cultural attitudes.
Sensitive, socialist, pluralist, ecological,
all of that. And I do think that's a real thing. And but they're reactive to the kind of to the left, to the social justice wing of the Democratic Party and the woke wing. So that's interesting. I mean, the IDW camp falls into that a little bit. Some of them have gone. That's the intellectual dark web for listeners. Some of those guys have gone a little more reactionary modernism and almost reactionary conservative, like someone like Dave Rubin just become a kind of partisan for the right in some ways, and based on his kind of anti-woke, anti-socialist, anti-green in some ways, anti-postmodern sensibilities. But then other people, they don't quite fit into that line, like Rogan and the Weinsteins.
It's really hard to put the Weinsteins and Rubin in the same category.
Well, Weinstein's,
why is there even a name for that?
No, right. Exactly. No, that's right. You're absolutely right. Weinstein's are Bernie Sanders guys, but it's interesting.
What about your inner life? What, at this point in your life, what are your favorite or most commonly deployed inner practices?
My favorite inner practice is a very nice, I don't know, either a Pinot or Bordeaux, I think is the no.
It literally goes inside me.
Good question. Honestly, I like, some listeners won't know my background, but I did a lot of years of practice. I did much of my life. I did an hour or two of meditation a day, sometimes more. In the community I was part of, we used to do, prostrations, the practice of prostrations where it's like the Tibetan Buddhists do some, and I probably estimate my life, I probably did nearly 1 million prostrations over the course of, a decade of my life. And so I took practice very seriously through part of my life. And in this section of my life, this part of my life, I've sort of been it's felt sort of right and healthy to be a little more, I don't do a lot of meditation or a lot of inner practice. I mean, I have a men's group I meet with. I have some, my wife and I have a very close relationship, and I have friends who I can.
Is it fair to say the social and emotional dimensions play a much bigger role in your inner practice now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they did before too. I shouldn't say they didn't before, but what it is more I'm a little more exterior focused in my life right now. What I want to do in the world, the impact I want to have, the interests I have, I had to deal with the fact that I need to get my economics. I have to make money, if I ever want to retire, if I ever want to be able to do the things I want to do, I need to spend some time doing that. I didn't do that in my 20s and 30s and even some of my 40s. So I've had to be more attentive to that dimension of my life and actually make some money and put myself in economically a better situation. So because of that, I feel like this has been a more exterior period of my life where I spent so much time on my inner worlds and on making that I just haven't spent the kind of time. And I feel like that pendulum may swing at some point where there'll be a little more focus. It's sort of been natural that this era has been different that way. And so I don't want to tell you, I'm always try to engage in all those pieces of me, all those pluralistic selves. But my focus is a little more external.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get, when you get good at something, it doesn't always stand out as much anymore. It gets folded into a lot of other things you're doing. But
I feel blessed. I feel blessed in my life to have. Of course, I have all kinds of development that I still need to do, and we're always evolving, and I'm focused on that in all kinds of ways. But in my 20s, I was seeking very intensively. I was seeking for answers. I was seeking for depth. I was seeking for meaning. I was seeking for enlightenment. I was seeking in a very intensive way. And I feel like I was able to fulfill the aim of that seeking. I felt like I was able to fulfill it in all kinds of ways. And I feel like I found depth. In some respects, I found enlightenment, even though enlightenment was something different, I think, than what I thought it was. I found a lot of what I was looking for, and some of what I was looking for was different than what I was looking for. But I was able to in a way where at this point in my life, I'm not seeking in those kinds of ways I'm not trying to find myself. I'm not the spiritual seeker of my youth is quenched. That fire is quenched, and it's been replaced by this love of culture and interest in evolution and interested in development in all kinds of ways, inner and outer. But that fire of my youth is quenched, and it's become something very different.
Yeah. So there's this hyper seeking you, and then there's this you now, and in between there's, on the one hand, getting a lot of the things you were seeking for and therefore not having to do it. And then on the other end, the development, I'm sure, of a sensibility that critiques and gets free of the seeking impulse in various ways.
Right. Sure.
But I'm curious what else, like, I'm a little bit curious about your development. Like, what do you think you got from hours of daily meditation and millions of prostrations? Would this Carter exist without them? Or
No.
You know, how much difference did it make? What did it do for you? All that discipline, let's say.
It sometimes it's hard to answer that question because I'm so different at the end of all of that. And, I was part of a community, and we were doing a lot of community work. We were doing circling in 1992, and all that, and we did a lot of that stuff. It's a great question. It's a fair question. And I'm probably really bad at answering it because it's like, who I am at the end of all of that is so different than who I was when I was, of course I'm still the same me. I still had this personality then, no doubt. But like the way I see life and how I've come through life, there was a part of me that wanted to there was a couple different impulses in my youthful seeking self. But one of those impulses was in seeking for depth and intensity and meaning and life. I was seeking away from the world, and I was moving away at right angles to the rest of the world, and that was what I needed at that time, I think. And in some ways I left the world. I was celibate in my 20s. I shaved my head. I lived in a radical community. I was doing different things. And that process eventually, like the further I went down that road and the more authentically I was able to deliver on what I was seeking, the more it brought me back, the more it began to turn. And I felt like I came back to the world from a new vantage point. And I got really interested in culture and the development of culture. And part of the discovering integral was also that path. But it little by little, like the deeper I went, the more I turned, until eventually I found myself back in this world that I had sort of had this impulse to get away from, in love with, in a very different way. And in love with life and my life, in the development of culture and everything, all the possibilities of the world, in a weird way. And I don't think I ever could have gotten back here unless I'd gone through all that, and unless I developed in all the ways I developed, unless I was able to experience the spiritual experiences and be able to be outside of the world and be able to be, and experience some of those things that you only get when you almost kind of leave it all behind and just focus on one's own development and focus on, non-dual realms. But I'm so grateful for that, because I feel like I can never engage the way I do now with the things I do, with the freedom I do,
right,
without that, because there'd always be these other parts of me, and I just can never. And I feel like there's a wholeheartedness with which I can sort of live. I don't know, there's some sort of that I could never have lived wholeheartedly in that way before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes terrific sense. I mean, it reminds me of, I have a little ditty in my head sometimes. It goes, the other thing I want is this, right? Which is that I'm all of a sudden, I'm moving away from engagement in this life, in this moment. And I'm either trying to secure something or get to some other value. But if I check what I'm trying to secure or the other thing I want, it's always an example of engaging the world that I live in, regardless of its imperfection. So I'm like, oh, right, that other thing that I want is committing fully to this.
Yeah.
And like the more I see that loop, the more it just seems to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it was a funny path. I think it was the opposite path that is the traditional path, which is you do the householder thing, and then you, in your 50s or whatever, you kind of take up the robes and you get interested. I sort of did exactly the opposite as
a reverse householder.
Reverse. Now, the challenge of that is you don't make the money in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. So you have to. That's the challenge of that.
But I'm running into that to myself. I didn't even have a credit card before 2 years ago. I was so far off the grid. When I was
exactly. So it's not without its challenges. But look, I could never, like now, I can never do the things I did in my 20s and 30s at this point in my life. I'm just not committed in that way to that path. But I'm but I look back, I remember, I'm very appreciative of that self that wanted to do those things, and the things I experienced and the fulfillments of that path, and the challenges. Look, tremendous challenges too, in all kinds of ways. I mean, anyway, that's probably another book at some point.
Sure. Well, I'm out of questions. Anything else you want to talk about?
So what are your podcasts? What are your podcasts you like?
I really enjoy Rogan. Rogan. I've been sort of enjoying. I interviewed this guy from BC. It's called T for Tada. Very often it's just him monologuing, but it's very strange and therapeutic and sexual and alchemical and just it's very provocative. I seldom agree with him, but I like being provoked by it. What else am I listening to? I mean, classics, like I love the WTF podcast with Mark Maron. He's sort of
that's cool. I know that one.
Started but those guys like Rogan, when there's thousands of it, it's about the guest. You're like, do I want to listen to that guy be talking?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But what Maron brings into it is, he's been in therapy, he's been through AA, he's lived a gritty life. So the way he digs into somebody's psychology and pathology, I think, is fascinating. Like I love
that's cool. That's hard. Yeah. That's a skill.
It's also tough. Like the things we talk about people too, they're very high level. And so just to track them, you got to go into this place. It's hard to take 10 minutes out of a conversation about the nature of precognition, right? And be like, tell me about how upset you were when you got divorced.
Right. No, it makes sense. I always feel like with me, like partially because I lived in this weird radical at the time. Now it doesn't seem so radical, but spiritual community in my 20s, I kind of you get a little bit protected from how you engage because you have this weird life that people don't. And so sometimes I feel like I'm still sometimes too protected. Sometimes I always feel like people, I always say, ask me lots of questions, because the more people ask, the more comes out. And so that skill to really probe and get what you want is a skill that's important.
I love Jim Rutt's work. Because he's so boisterous. I've interviewed him a few times, and it's like talking to Yosemite Sam or something. Like you're not getting this vulnerable person, you're getting this expansive, very smart guy who can just roam anywhere. But it makes me go into that same kind of mode. So that's a lot of fun, and he gets great guests. A lot of stuff I like to listen to is in that game B complexity theory kind of area.
Oh, that's interesting.
That has applications for every domain.
That's cool.
Thought.
And in terms of the esoteric and high weirdness and UFOs and stuff like that, who do you listen to?
His name's. Anything Kripal does is really good. Anything Sean Hargens does is really good.
I love Kripal, so I'm trying to get Sean on. I'm trying to get Sean on to have a conversation. So
I interviewed him for Rebel Wisdom. That was my first Rebel Wisdom.
How was that? How was it?
It was great. We had a real nice rapport, and it's great if I can be like, okay, here's the people are like aliens or not, and I'm like, so rather than that, you go, here's 4 things it could be, and Sean's like, yes, those are 4 of the 10 things it could be.
Here's the other 20. That's good. I like that. And I love Kripal. Kripal's he knows everyone that's feeling. He's been doing it a long time. The one sometimes he'll go, well, it's a paradox. I'm like, no, it's not. It's like, I know it's a paradox, but I'm in the camp where I always want to try to figure it out anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Michael Garfield on Future Fossils is really good. I've listened to him a lot. Talked to him recently.
Interesting.
He's really cool. He can just go. He loves time, Terrence McKenna stuff.
Yeah,
folded
right.
realities,
that high
all that
weirdness.
kind of
Terrence
amazing.
McKenna. He's like the godfather of the high weirdness.
Oh, he was one of my couple of boyhood heroes for sure.
That's cool. That's good.
Actually,
did you have a psychedelic history?
Yeah, in my like early 20s, I went through a period of, and it was just.
See, this is the only thing I'm still waiting to go through my psych. I'm still like planning my psychedelic phase. I
read a lot of Robert Anton Wilson and Terrence McKenna in my like mid-teens, and so then when I got into a position where I could access some of these chemicals, I did it, but I did it the way I thought you were supposed to, which was the way they were doing it in the late 60s. Right. Like, well, Timothy Leary started with a spoonful of LSD. I'm not going to take 2 hits and go to a party. I want to be locked in a dark room for 2 days, and I'm going to take 30 tabs of this stuff. So my friends were all like, no, that's not what we want drugs for.
Don't do that. It's not
like, no,
good.
I'm going to do this briefly, and I'm going to go all the way in.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out what happened.
Interesting. Has that been true?
Yeah, well, not as much. It was for a while, about 10, 15 years of telling yourself a different story about what went down and what it might mean. And, I love the plural kind of intelligence that developed in me about that every time I got new insights, but it's not as significant to me anymore. It doesn't, doesn't pain me to know what the answer might be.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I want to get Sean on and talk. I've been trying to broach the UFO subject without like alienating the rest of my podcast listeners, because it's it's real. A lot of people, they haven't embraced yet that the reality that this is a thing we need to talk about. It's like, so I was trying to get Sean on. I was going to get Sean on, and also it's hard in that field. And I think it's getting better because people are getting smarter about it. But for a while in that field, it just seemed like so many people in that field, they either drink the Kool-Aid or they're skeptical. And it's like there are very few people in between you could really have really interesting conversations with, but I think there's more now. And Sean's
I think there's more now, and the weird thing is almost everybody's experience is actually in that in-between area. So now there's people who can speak to that.
Yeah. At that Esalen thing I was at, so I don't know how far deep you are, but Jacques Vallée and Strieber were there, and then Gary Nolan, Gary Nolan. So he's
a little bit, not as much as I know Vallée.
Right. So Vallée was great. I mean, he's older now. He's like this.
Sure. He was the first guy who ever made me think in terms of dimensions rather than extraterrestrials.
Passport to Magonia or whatever, Magolia or whatever it is, Magnolia.
And Mabinogian, something like that.
Some passport or something. And but he was great. He was very impressive. I mean, he gave a whole presentation about, I don't know, about like maybe it's all virtual, maybe we're all in a virtual simulation or something, which I don't totally buy. But Gary Nolan, who's the guy, he's a Stanford geneticist, I think, who's one of the more serious scientists in the world right now. He's doing all these studies he presented all this material and doing studies of people brain studies of people who've been injured by having contact experiences, and a lot of special forces people have been injured. And it was eye-opening. It was like, wow. It was like, and him and Kit Green, who did the original remote viewing stuff with the CIA, and listening to him give this presentation, it was, I walked out of there, I was thinking, new shit has come to light. It's like, there's some interesting, people are doing some interesting research, and it was very funny because I literally, I walked out of that. So I'm in this little room and he's giving this whole presentation all about like contact experiences and special forces and the part of the brain that is responsible for psychic phenomenon and all this stuff that was like, and he's like, like a Nobel Prize level scientist at Stanford. And it's just like, and you're like, wow, that's wild. And I kind of walked out there, my mind was half blown. And I walked over to the lunch. I was at Esalen. I walked by and I walked by Morpheus. And it was actually Morpheus. It was Lawrence Fishburne. He was there at Esalen. And you just think, what world, what
hell is going on?
What here? Reality am I in right now? It's like, anyway, it's fun.
There's something really interesting about all this stuff, which is like what's the skill set required to make those experiences surfable rather than impacting us as if they're trauma? Because I think we're in a situation now, whether it's a UFO experience or it's just how weird the world is or whatever's going to happen next.
Yeah.
It's so strange and so incongruous that for people who are loose and open and multifarious and quasi-shamanic, they have this, oh, I could probably ride this out. But for a lot of other people, if they can't, then it's just a hit and it's going to put them into a trauma mode. And that makes a lot of things dangerous.
You're right. It really does. It really does. And I think, and there's this whole faction. I even asked Gary, I went up to him afterwards. I said, what's it like to work with the military and all this stuff? And he was kind of like, well, he didn't say much, but it was just a moment conversations. But he said, a lot of people in the military, they're religious and they don't like it. They don't like it at all. And it's like demons, or it's just something weird, something that's weird. So weird that it becomes a kind of like almost like a trauma, and they just see it through that religious lens. And it's hard, or like you see there's a traumatic element to it. And I think this is true with spiritual experience. It's so similar to spiritual experience as well. And, one of the things I felt I had to learn in my own life was like what spiritual experience signifies and what it doesn't, and, over and over again, you see people who have, all kinds of psychological issues and leaky boundaries and various things. They can have incredibly beautiful and powerful spiritual experiences. And it's like, and that's something awesome about that. And yet it's something we need to not put it on a pedestal as a culture. We need to just be able to look at it and say, wow, that's interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean something about you or me or anything. And I feel the same is true with esoteric experiences. We need to be able to like hold it in an investigatory, I don't know why I can't say that word, in a context in which we don't like put it on a pedestal. Oh my God, you have this, it means so much, it's like, or in whatever way as like incredible trauma, something we should like, bow to as the future shamanic truth. But be able to just look at it honestly, and doesn't have to mean it, it's hard to do. It's hard to do because we so want to put it in a highly significant categories like this thing, either a bad thing or a good thing. Yeah. And spiritual experience is similar,
The whole notion of a hierarchy of states is very suspicious. I talked to Alan Combs from the Wilbur Combs Matrix.
Yeah.
Because I think it still hasn't really been assimilated, right? We're going to take these states and not go, the subtle is better than the gross and the causal is better than the subtle and the non-dual is the best of all. You go, no, they're all always available and no one of them is the best. You need to be able to move through them and look at all of them. That's better than getting stuck in any of them, even if you're really good at it.
Yeah, right. No, it's good. And even if you say, well, a certain type of non-dual experience is the deepest, let's say the deepest. Yeah, okay, maybe it is. Maybe like that deep non-dual is like getting underneath reality to a degree that's just, there's something absolutely, something that grounds us in being in a way that's just prior to everything. And but that's very dangerous and tricky how you deal with that in and of itself. It's like each one has its own upsides and downsides. Each one has its own potential pitfalls and not,
the bottom of the ocean is not necessarily better than the surface of the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. Like I remember my teacher, like we used to joke, like I remember my teacher, when he would get into really deep non-dual states, like on a retreat or something, he would say really stupid shit about the world. He'd say beautiful stuff about meditation, but it would make him less able to make the kinds of distinctions that you need to make when you're in the world, when you're talking about cultural and evolution, different things like that, because that truth was real. And there's something beautiful about that truth being real, but that truth is not this truth. It doesn't translate, it doesn't make you smarter about this. And like the confidence and the deep conviction and truth that's found in states like that does not help us make sense of other things. So being able, like you say, to surf through all those, I have this long-term book I want to write about this issue called Mysticism and Its Discontents, about how do we not put those things on the pedestal, hold them out, but engage with them with all of their beauty that they are, and dignity and just power and this authenticity that those states of being are, without then turning into something that will inevitably delude us and blind us. It's a tough question. And the same is true with esoteric.
Even the people who make a strong social stand for really going into some particular area of that, we need them to do that. But in order to fulfill what they're hoping for, the society has to normalize it in order to integrate it and get better at it. And that means it has to not treat it as really weird or really special or absolute alternative to everything else. It's got to be one of the regular things.
Exactly.
So we can all start getting into it more.
Exactly. and without diminishing it.
Yeah.
But being able, it's so true. Yeah. It's so important. And I don't know, can we do that as a future society? That would be amazing, but it takes something to do that authentically. It's very hard. I've seen, the smartest people in the world just abandon all their intellectual capacity the moment they encounter something in the spiritual realm. It's like, don't do that, don't abandon everything. Obviously, in a state of being, you might temporarily abandon your cognitive apparatus, but, in a general way, don't abandon it. Like, you can't make sense of it. Like, it's just, and I feel like we as a society, we have to get better at doing that. Otherwise, it stays in some other dimension. And we can't integrate it in ways that are healthy, Yeah,
it's got to be able to, for any given person, they can be radically transformed by some of these things. But in order to create a transformed society, all these things have to be structured and enfolded. Yeah, and that's where we need to get to. Otherwise, the future is just a terrible society with occasionally illuminated people in it.
No, it's true. Yeah, it's true. It's like, you asked me the question about the self, right? It's like part of maturity as a self is being able to incorporate, more aspects of the self without becoming them or having to push them outside the barriers of yourself in order to deal with reality, right? So you can embrace more of who you are while not becoming all those pieces, that will not falling into it. But it's true as a society too. We have to push those boundaries and embrace more of who we are as a society, and more of these dimensions that now are just pushed out and not dealt with, without then, making them more than what they are, or letting them dominate. We have these little subcultures that take them seriously, but then sometimes they just dominate those subcultures and they're everything. And then the rest of the society ignores it completely. It's like we have to, as a healthier society, we have to get beyond that split.
There's you don't even always know how long to talk to somebody.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going.
No, it's fine, because there's a moment I'm usually looking for. Like, I talked to Rupert Sheldrake. He and I had a great conversation, but it wasn't long enough for me to get to this place I want to get to, which is like just now when you were talking about. This is so nice being with Carter. My heart opens. I kind of melt toward you, and I'm like, that's it. That's the punctuation mark. That means it's been a successful conversation as far as I'm concerned. So thanks very much. This has been delightful, Carter.
I really appreciate it, Layman. Thank you for doing it. It's fun to talk about all kinds of things. I like someone who I can go all these places with. I hope it makes sense to your listeners.
I hope so too. And if it doesn't, too bad.